Book review time. Tonight I want to talk about A Walk in My Combat Boots. It's by James Patterson and Matt Eversman, real life hero of Black Hawk Down. It's basically a collection of short stories about US military personnel operating in the US Armed Forces and their own personal stories about what happened in their particular careers. Last week I did a review of the Irish Navy, and in it I mentioned it a couple of times. We've got a couple of HR issues that we need to sort out, and I just couldn't help noticing as I read through this particular book. It was only supposed to be light reading, and I started to realize that there's some things that we could learn from the United States Armed Forces. True, they're far in comparison, they are, I suppose, the very top, the highest standard any military in the world can ever achieve. And indeed, for the last 40 to 50 years, they have shown themselves to be very resilient in the times that we're in. And indeed, they are the very anchor towards international security. And if anything, we should be drawn down and taking a look at the standards that they set and try to get emulate them as best we can, because it is indeed the U.S. Armed Forces. It's not just an organization; it's a culture. It's embedded in the American society, and I suppose when I look at the first selection of stories, the first chapter is called "A Call to Duty." And in that particular chapter, basically, it's all about different personnel and their reactions to what happened in 9/11, the attack on the Twin Towers and the Pentagon. And before I go into that, I was asking myself, like, what gave these people the sudden urge to get involved, the sudden urge to enlist in the US Armed Forces? And I suppose it goes right back to the fall of the Berlin Wall and the collapse of the USSR. At the time, it was the early 80s, and when the Soviet regime started collapsing, it kind of imploded fairly fast. Um, but in general, we all felt that democracy had won. And it was a matter of time before all those communist regimes would start falling apart and they would open themselves up to Western values, democracy values, and, that it would free their people, or so we thought, or so we hoped. But in America, what that meant was that the United States military in the late 80s, it was no longer necessary to have a Cold War stance anymore. There was politically, it was seen it was really necessary to have such a large military machine organization there. So what happened to the US military was it actually started to shrink, and they started depending more on research into more advanced weapons, new ways of warfare. And I suppose it really came to a head when a dictator in Iraq, Saddam Hussein, um, acted naughty and basically invaded Kuwait. And this gave the US military and its allies the opportunity to show to the world just what's going to happen if anybody tries to upset the New World Order, the balance, the peace and the harmony, the international security. And that came in the form of Desert Storm, where over the course of 4 days, the Iraqi army was literally annihilated in Kuwait, and Baghdad was showered by hundreds of what were they? Tomahawk missiles from stealth planes like the F-117, the B-2 Spirit bomber, and all the DDG class missile frigates that were deployed in the seas around Iraq. So after Desert Storm, the West kind of thought to themselves, we all thought to ourselves that that would be the end of that. You know, we showed the power, the shock and awe. Everybody was going to step in line. But what we didn't realize was it actually brought about the birth of something known as global terrorism in the form of Al Qaeda and in the form of being financed by belligerent countries in the shadows, and we all know those things. But the culmination uh, by Desert Shield was in the late 90s, and it was 2004, 2005, the September 11th. By that time, the American culture at the time, you had lots of movies like Top Gun, lots of different movies showing how strong the United States is, how resilient they are. So when the attacks happened, the September 11th attacks happened, it really hit the hearts and minds of the American people, so much so that in the first few stories, a lot of 17 to 21-year-olds felt a very strong urge to join the United States forces, and they all knew straight away that they wanted to contribute, to get involved in the fight. And when you know something about 18 to 21-year-olds, you know there's no stopping them. When they get an idea in their heads, you just can't get them to turn to change tack. Also, in line, the enlisted personnel, the people that were already in the U.S. military when the September 11th attacks happened, they knew straight away that the line had been crossed and America was at war. So, Call to Duty is just a list of stories about people's reactions to the September 11th. The next chapter is called In Training, and it's a selection of stories about uh, enlisted personnel's experience in the various careers that they chose. And what I got from it was, firstly, at the beginning of a lot of those stories, there's a little code at the beginning of the story, and it's like CN11 or FB32. And I was kind of, it intrigued me, so I looked it up. And basically, what that is a military operative speciality. In other words, a category of career, of specialist career within the service. For example, CM11 is basic infantry. But in in the US Army, you've got something like 190 MOSs, which are different specialities from sniper to caterer to dog handler, you know. And in the United States Armed Forces, there's something like 2,000 different categories that you could find yourself into, 2,000 different category career choices that you can make out of them. And when you go to the recruitment agency, what they do is they measure what are your strengths, what are your weaknesses, and they match you to whatever specialities that are available for your particular skill level. And on top of that, when you do actually join, when you sign up, now don't quote me on this, but it looks like you do 3 years training and you do 4 years deployment. And in the 3 years that you're training, um, you know, firstly, if you don't like the specialty that you're in, you could always touch back with there's a HR department there. You can touch back to them and say, this isn't working out for me, I want to try something else. And they'll accommodate you as best as they can. Or if you want to join a particular specialty and that particular class is full, you're kept on a waiting list until there's a spot open for you and you take it, whatever that is. And the numbers of different careers that are there, you could be nurse, financial controller, software systems engineer, network controller, loading helicopters. There's a whole scatter of different categories to choose from. And literally, if you have what it takes to do that course, um, you are in line to actually do it once you're enlisted. And so, what I got from it was there was a story there about a lady there who had, she became a helicopter manager. She was in charge of managing a fleet of helicopters, and the thing about that was she was able to take those skills, and when she'd finished her contract, she was able to go to the bank with a proper business plan, and she was able to form her own company or business or service out of it. And that's a regular occurrence within the defense in the United States military forces. They're not just they see their they see joining the military as an avenue for progressing in whatever career field that they want to get into. Um, so it was very interesting to see, and it's just a way of doing things for a lot of Americans who can't afford to go to college or university. By joining the army or the navy or the marines, this is their opportunity to level up their skills and make a difference in their careers afterwards. Um, that was in training. What else did I get from it? Yeah, also the training itself, whatever specialist courses that they're doing, they're trained to a very high standard. It's a standard that would be as good as, if not better than, one that you get out of civil life. And on top of that training, you get a structured um, way of living, a disciplined way of living. So it's not just career focused, it's about personal development as well. Um, in country, then, is a collection of stories about different personnel and their experiences while they were out on the job. And a couple of really interesting facts really hit home in some of these stories. A lot of them are, what happens to them when they come in contact with the enemy. One particular saying that we have in the army is the best laid plans are rubbish on contact with the enemy. In other words, you can think or you can have whatever ideas and beliefs in your head, but when you hear a bullet flying over your head, it gets very, very personal very, very quickly. And in should you survive that particular incident, you will spend the rest of your life questioning and doubting and fearing and looking for reasons, and it drives people mad. It's called PTSD. And the only way to negate that PTSD is, firstly, from the very beginning, from A Call to Duty, from the very first chapter, you have to understand with crystal clarity why you were there in the first place, who, what, where, when, and how. You have to understand completely why you were in that particular situation, and that's the only way you can reconcile with yourself with whatever had happened in that particular situation. Because otherwise, if you go in with the wrong ideas, it's really bad. And I did a previous podcast on Karina Mulloy. She's one of the first female soldiers to join the Irish Army, and she did not have a positive experience at all about it. And even today, we have the Me Too movement that's still ongoing, and the Defence Forces are under review on account of that. But it at the end of the day, a career in the military is probably, it is, in fact, the most challenging job you could ever find yourself in. If you can survive a career in the military, everything else is easy. So the best way to survive a career in the military is to absolutely know what you're getting into and have a crystal clear plan on how, who, what, where, when, how, and why, to get out of it unscathed. Some stories that got to me in chapter 3. Firstly, there was a story about a particular lady that was captured in Afghanistan. She was nicknamed Lady Al Qaeda. And the worst thing about her was not only was she on America's Most Wanted for all sorts of terrorism acts, including murder, but she was so lethal that when she was at they brought her out for a press conference, and she actually managed to take a gun from one of the guards and shoot somebody in the chest. Um, what really is even worse about it was the fact that she grew up in the United States and that she'd actually got a high qualification from MIT. Another story that got to me was a particular soldier. His parents were from Indian descent, and when he was on duty in Afghanistan, the Taliban were specifically hunting for him on account of the fact that they thought he was Afghan and that he looked like them, and he was a target as soon when he got on country. Another story that I got, an interesting, intriguing kind of story, was um, in when Senior Command were planning Desert Shield, which was the second war in Iraq. During the planning, they calculated that if Saddam used his biological or chemical weapons, they calculated that there would be about 7,000 people dead on the battlefield. And this particular officer, he was in charge of the mortuary division, which was about taking those bodies off the battlefield. He was tasked with figuring out how to bring those bodies back to the States, and he found that it would they couldn't airlift those bodies on account of the fact that the chemicals that would be on the skins of the corpses, once they get into the cabin pressure of the airplane, um, those bodies are sweating, and if there's enough of those bodies in the airplane, and if that sweat is transferring up into the air, then the entire airplane would be contaminated. So an airlift was ruled out. Furthermore, they looked at refrigerated transport, which was going to be extremely difficult on account of the fact that they'd be rolling across the desert in refrigerated transport, which would be just as hazardous. But in the end, fortunately, there was no such casualties. Um, but I remember at the time there was grave concerns for having soldiers operating in the desert, in Desert Shield, and they were all equipped with NBC gear, gas masks, and suits, and they were all drilled regularly, extremely regularly, on putting those suits on. And that was on account of the fact that if there was an attack, not many of them would have been able to make it home. The fourth chapter on the home front, again in terms of HR, um, when you're enlisted, your family get free health care, your family get free dental care, your family gets accommodation, especially if they go abroad to Germany or to around the world. I'm sure they have accommodation in the States as well. They're very well looked after. On top of that, if you're injured, if you're in theatre and you're injured, no expense is spared at getting you to the best medical treatment. And be it, there was a story there about an injured person having to be airlifted from Bagram Air Base to Germany and then on to Walter Reed in the States for specific surgery. Just that one person, within hours of being mortally wounded, he was transported back to the States. Um, it's incredible from a logistics point of view to be able to provide services like that for your enlisted personnel. Finally, you have Memorial Day, which is about what do those enlisted people do after their contracts are up, and of course they're suffering from PTSD and the like. But there's also people there who make a positive impact on it, who go on to again further their careers, go out into self-employment, and not only that, but find opportunities to help the military afterwards. For example, in terms of housing, making sure that veterans are housed properly, that they're looked after properly in their old age, providing services and products for the military after and during while they're there, because they can actually have contracts with US military to provide services and products as well on top of that. So overall, what I got from walking my combat boots, it led me to two interesting questions, I suppose. Firstly, um, firstly, when I think about it, when September the 11th started, um, so many American people knew straight away in their heads, in their hearts, in their souls that it was the right thing to do to go to Iraq and go to Afghanistan and to combat terror and to make the world a better, safer place. Um, that was, and this is, and they've maintained that belief over the last 25, 30 years. And it, it brings into question, it brings up the question, what does Europe or what does Ireland have to do to um, for ordinary people to actually realize that we have to take ownership for our own security, for like what kind of emergency or military or security tragedy has to happen before we all suddenly realize, we should have had services, and we should have been looking at this particular issue for a long time. So it does bring into question, like, where is the line? For example, in Ukraine, the war isn't going very well for Ukraine at the moment. If Trump gets elected, and if America was to stand back, who's going to fill that gap? Can we afford to do that? Is that a tragedy in the making that could happen? The best way to go about it is to realize, the sooner we realize that we should be investing in military infrastructure, and bringing in a culture where we realize the importance of security and we used to call it civic duty. It's all about how do we handle ourselves in an emergency. I was in the civil defense, and that was way back in the late 90s. It's a very small organization, but they seem to be the only people capable of handling a national emergency, or maybe the army or the guards as well. But what level do we have to wait for before we have to take a stand for ourselves? That's all I have to say. Take care. I don't want to end this podcast on a negative vibe. What I'm trying to get at is that over the last 35, 40 years, it's been enshrined in the American society and culture to have a resilient military infrastructure, to have a strong military. Military. So, in the States, like, even when things like when the Americans pulled out of Afghanistan, it was highly questionable, and it still is questionable at the time, but people weren't straight away blaming the military on their decision to do so. They just rolled with it and they went on with it. And likewise, any any sort of military operations that the United States are involved in, the people have faith in their military, and they know that it won't let them down. So, you know, that's a sign of things for the future, and it'll probably take 10, 15, 20 years for us to catch up to that level of what would you call it, civic mindedness. That's all I have to say. Take care.